As war clouds gathered in the late 1930s, the world was becoming divided into two primary camps: those supportive of National Socialism and Fascism, and those opposed, to include the Communist Soviet Union. In the U.S., there was a major anti-war movement, the America First Collective, who, remembering the horrors of World War I, did not want American involvement in the Spanish Civil War of 1936-39, and then again opposed to ever becoming involved in World War II in Europe after the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. They also did not want any involvement regarding Japan's imperial expansion in China, all of which was opposite of the position of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and, in 1940, British Prime Minister of Great Britain Winston S. Churchill, who by that time was already at war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. But one prominent American crossed the Atlantic alone and became a global icon, a symbol of American courage, strength, and ingenuity. But just a decade later, Charles Lindbergh stood before thousands, accused of siding with the Nazis, blaming Jews for war, and turning his back on everything he once stood for. How did America's greatest hero fall so far? Who was Charles Lindbergh? What was his position on non-intervention? What was his life like afterward? To understand the controversy, we have to start at the beginning.
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born February 4, 1902 in Detroit, Michigan, and Lindbergh grew up on a farm in Minnesota. His father was a prominent lawyer and congressman, and he supported Charles Jr. when he studied mechanical engineering at the University of Wisconsin to prepare for a life in aviation. Lindbergh took flying lessons and had his first solo flight in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was rated as a natural and skilled pilot. He then began working as a barnstormer, a daredevil pilot performing at regional fairs and air shows where he amazed the crowds with his aerial stunts. Lindbergh wanted a career in aviation, so he joined the U.S. Army in 1924 and became an Air Service Reserve pilot. But in his civilian life, he became an airmail pilot, flying a route between St. Louis and Chicago. Lindbergh was well aware that hotel owner Raymond Ortag mysteriously offered a $25,000 prize in 1919 to the first pilot who could fly from New York to Paris non-stop, which Lindbergh has a challenge worth taking. Sponsored and funded, Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field in Long Island, New York on May 20, 1927, flying a single-engine plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. The aircraft was nothing more than a flying gas tank, and it took him 33.5 hours to cover the more than 3,600 miles. When he landed at Le Bourget Field near Paris on May 21, 1927, having made the world's first solo transatlantic flight, he was greeted by a crowd of 100,000 people and became an instant international celebrity. In effect, he became the most famous man in the world. The cover of the New York Times summed it up best, the nation's jubilation, with the simple headline, "Lindbergh did it." When he returned to the United States, Lindbergh was presented the Distinguished Flying Cross by President Calvin Coolidge, and on December 14, 1927, by act of Congress, Lindbergh was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation reads, "For displaying heroic courage and skill as a navigator at the risk of his life by his non-stop flight in his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis from New York City to Paris, France, 2021 May 1927, which Captain Lindbergh not only achieved the greatest individual triumph of any American citizen, but demonstrated that travel across the ocean by aircraft was possible." Lindbergh was also on the cover of every major newspaper in the world and did numerous radio shows, but his fame would become increasingly and exponentially curious after the kidnapping and murder of his young son 4 years later. His 20-month-old son was abducted from his crib in Lindbergh's New Jersey home, and again Lindbergh made international headlines. 2 months later, riding another nationwide media frenzy and FBI investigation, the child's remains were discovered in the woods near the Lindbergh's home. German immigrant Bruno Hauptmann, a 36-year-old German-born carpenter, was arrested September 19, 1934 in the Bronx, New York, after he used a $10 bill from the ransom to pay for gas at a service station. He was found guilty and died in the electric chair, and see our video on that subject, being the electric chair. Lindbergh's historic flight, combined with the public's anguish over the kidnapping and murder of his young child, damaged him, and the nation felt his pain. But Lindbergh began to involve himself in politics, and he began to give speeches at rallies, where he was perceived as an anti-Semite and later a Nazi sympathizer, which shocked the public. Lindbergh spent several years before World War II actively campaigning to protect the white race, and after World War II, started campaigning for the U.S. to maintain strict neutrality toward Nazi Germany. But what concerned many Americans, especially Jewish citizens, were his apparently supportive statements regarding the Nazi Party in Germany and their policies towards those considered non-German. Lindbergh felt that there should be a similar movement in the U.S. regarding inferior races, and he openly supported the Margaret Sanger eugenics mindset. See our video on Margaret Sanger. Lindbergh was very popular in Germany, which was full of old-school pilots from World War I, as well as the thriving civil aviation business through the creation of Lufthansa. World War I ace and personal pilot to Adolf Hitler, Generalleutnant Hans Bauer, stated, "As a World War I pilot myself, and being surrounded by men like Yashonik, Udet, von Schleich, and others, we all wanted to meet him. Hitler extended an invitation for him to come to Germany, as had other well-known Americans, especially Henry Ford. Goering was very excited to meet him, also being a World War I expert pilot." The U.S. military requested that Lindbergh visit Germany several times between 1936 and 1938 to inspect the country's air force, basically an intelligence-gathering mission, and evaluate the growing Luftwaffe. During the Spanish Civil War, Hitler used that conflict as a proving ground, testing new aircraft designs. U.S. intelligence wanted reports on their aircraft capabilities. Lindbergh was eager to comply, and he was the first American to fly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and examine their latest bomber, the Junkers Ju-88. He wrote detailed reports on their capabilities and limitations. In 1938, during his last visit to Germany, he attended a special dinner with Hermann Goering and many other political and military luminaries, hosted by the American ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson. This was when Goering awarded Lindbergh the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. Henry Ford had the same award. A few weeks later, the Nazis launched Kristallnacht, and many in the U.S. pushed Lindbergh to return the German medal. He refused, saying, "If I were to return the German medal, it seems to me that it would be an unnecessary insult." Some of the premier German aircraft designers of the day were pleased to have him look at their latest models, such as Hugo Junkers and Professor Dr. Willy Messerschmitt. Indeed, Lindbergh's reports on these aircraft types influenced American aircraft design, especially with regard to the fuel-injected engines as opposed to those with carburetors. In his 1938 report, he wrote, "The German air fleet is stronger than that of all other European countries together," suggesting that Britain and France tried to come to some sort of agreement with Hitler while increasing their own warplane production. U.S. Army Air Corps General Henry H. Hap Arnold wrote in his autobiography, quote, "Nobody gave us as much useful information about Hitler's Air Force until Lindbergh came home in 1939." End quote. But it was Lindbergh's association with the Nativist America First Committee that would create a major turn in public opinion of him. As war loomed in Europe, Lindbergh was not alone in his isolationist viewpoints, as most Americans agreed with him until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. noted that, Some Republicans even urged Lindbergh to run for president against Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940 to keep America out of the war. FDR's administration, and please see our video on him, were war hawks determined to get the U.S. involved, and they did not appreciate Lindbergh, with his hero status being an opposing voice. After World War II broke out in Europe on September 1, 1939, Lindbergh wrote an article for the November issue of Reader's Digest titled, "Our Civilization Depends on Peace Among Western Nations." Lindbergh publicly and vehemently called for the U.S. not to intervene during Germany's invasions of Poland and Czechoslovakia, stating that it was a European issue. But in Lindbergh's defense, he not only openly opposed supporting Great Britain with war material, he also opposed assisting any of the belligerents, including Nazi Germany, on the grounds that America should not profiteer from the destruction and death of war by selling weapons to anyone. Lindbergh also wrote, "The trouble is that many people want France and England to fight without having the slightest idea of how they are going to fight. They never even think about the practical problems involved in waging a successful war." Lindbergh feared that if England and Germany enter another major war on opposite sides, Western civilization may fall as a result. He believed, however, that Germany's expansion toward the Soviet Union in the East would not present so great a peril. The Roosevelt administration was already in violation of neutrality laws due to the Lend-Lease program with Britain and the use of unflagged American warships to escort supply convoys across the Atlantic. Another argument against Lindbergh's position on supplying the Allies, primarily Britain, was that no one, other than actual American Nazis, were arguing the U.S. should sell weapons to Germany. In fact, Germany had no interest in obtaining American weapons or aircraft, as they had the most advanced military and weaponry in the world at that time. Their primary question among Lend-Lease supporters was whether or not to help the British by selling armaments and materiel to aid their war effort, and the same argument would be made in 1941 with regard to the Soviet Union. The Lend-Lease supporters' argument was that neutrality would simply allow Germany, which had already overrun France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway, to invade the British Isles, ensuring a Nazi victory. And this was pointed out at the time. Lindbergh had a lot of company, as there were plenty of isolationists who didn't want a German victory, but who also genuinely feared the consequences of getting dragged into the war on the side of the Allies. Lindbergh took it a few steps farther, and he began pushing anti-Semitic messaging in his arguments that was interpreted by many as actually aiding Nazi Germany's war effort through domestic propaganda. Lindbergh's statement during a radio program caused a lot of concern when he said, "We must ask who owns and influences the newspaper, the news, in general, picture, and radio stations. If our people know the truth, our country is not likely to enter the war." Lindbergh had insinuated that newspapers, radio, and all other media, as well as financial institutions, were controlled by Jews looking to plunge America into war, joining with the Allies. He stated, "We are both anxious to avoid this country being pushed into a European war by British and Jewish propaganda. I can understand the feeling of both the British and the Jews, but there is far too much at stake for us to rush into a European war without the most careful, cool consideration." Through his association with the AFC, his message reached millions over the radio, and he spoke to massive crowds, holding rallies around the country, especially the large event in New York's Madison Square Garden, which did not sit well with the war hawks in the FDR administration. But Lindbergh's message resonated with millions of Americans, especially the middle and upper-class American Gentiles. The apex of his philosophy was delivered in a speech on September 11, 1941, when he gave a speech at the AFC event in Des Moines, Iowa, from which his reputation would never recover. At this event, he said, "The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government, and wanting war when most Americans did not." The echo had hardly faded after he finished speaking when there was an immediate backlash from all sides of the political spectrum. The Republican presidential nominee in 1940, Wendell Willkie, called the speech the most un-American talk made in my time by any person of national reputation. President Roosevelt's press secretary released a statement comparing the speech with the outpourings of Berlin in the last few days, and newspapers across the country published their stories stating that Lindbergh was openly promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews, controlling the media, and the government behind the scenes. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the AFC dissolved on December 10, 1941. Lindbergh's position to the U.S. entering the war had just become a moot point, especially when Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which they were not bound to do by any treaty or agreement with their ally Japan. Roosevelt was quite upset with Lindbergh, and he barred him from working for the aircraft industry, including and especially United Aircraft, Curtiss-Wright, and Boeing. He did, however, go to work for Ford as an aviation consultant. As the war progressed, Lindbergh became invaluable to the war effort where aviation was concerned. He trained pilots stateside, assisted with technical improvements and modifications. Lindbergh even requested reinstatement in the Air Corps, but Roosevelt let it be known through the chain of command that Lindbergh was prohibited from serving. In 1943, Lindbergh managed to quietly join United Aircraft as an engineering consultant, devoting most of his time to its Chance-Vought division, focusing upon the Chance-Vought F4U-1 Corsair. In 1944, United Aircraft designated him as a technical representative, and he went to the Pacific to study plane performances under combat conditions. During his 6 months in theater to fix problems with aircraft assigned to operational units, Lindbergh made himself available as a technical expert, going wherever he was needed. Marine Fighter Ace and Medal of Honor recipient Joseph Foss was having problems with the Chance-Vought F4U-1 Corsairs and requested technical expertise. Foss said during his interview, "That was when I met Charles A. Lindbergh, my childhood hero, who I had tried but was unable to see when he visited back home. I was stunned. This was like sending the Pope to give battlefield communion. Well, he figured out all the bugs in the Corsair, mostly electrical from the wiring harness suffering from vibrations affecting contact points, and then we were cooking with gas. By the time he left, he had made a lot of friends. His recommendations on the Corsair went far up the chain of command and were addressed on the assembly line." Lindbergh would test fly modified aircraft, and he even flew 25 combat missions in the Corsair with Marine Fighter Squadrons VMF-216 and VMF-222, as well as flying in combat with the P-38 Lightning, with the Army Air Force teaching the P-38 pilots how to conserve fuel, increasing the range of the aircraft, which was a surprise to the Japanese. He was flying with Colonel Charles McDonald's 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, when his flight intercepted a Japanese group of fighters and dive bombers. One of them banked sharply and came straight at Lindbergh with guns blazing. Lindbergh fired back as the two aircraft closed at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour. His tracers slammed into the Japanese aircraft, a Mitsubishi Ki-51 Type 99 Sonya, flown by Captain Saburo Shimada, before pulling up at the last possible moment to avoid a collision. A split second later, the enemy plane exploded, then winged over and spiraled into the sea. The radios exploded with the news. Lindbergh shot down a Japanese aircraft, which spread rapidly through the ranks, quickly reaching General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the Pacific Theater, but it stopped there. MacArthur later met with Lindbergh and told him, "I'm glad you got one." As his presence in combat was in violation of international law, and he was a civilian and not at that time a uniformed member of the military, MacArthur sent him back home. Neither this aerial victory nor any of Lindbergh's other combat became part of the official record. "Lindbergh was indefatigable," remarked MacDonald. "He flew more missions than was normally expected of a regular combat pilot. He dive-bombed enemy positions, sank barges, and patrolled our landing forces. He was shot at by almost every anti-aircraft gun in western New Guinea. Lindbergh had something of a mild conversion upon seeing the Dora concentration camp after the defeat of Germany in 1945, and Lindbergh wrote in his journal, "Here was a place where men and life and death had reached the lowest form of degradation. How could any reward in national progress even faintly justify the establishment and operation of such a place? It seemed impossible that men, civilized men, could degenerate to such a level."
What the Germans have done to the Jews in Europe, we are doing to the Japanese in the Pacific.
After the war in 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower reactivated his Army Air Corps Commission, then U.S. Air Force, and appointed him Brigadier General, United States Air Force. Lindbergh withdrew from politics and started to lead a rather obscure life, avoiding the public eye. His book, The Spirit of St. Louis, became a blockbuster motion picture in 1957, directed by Billy Wilder and starring Jimmy Stewart as Lindbergh, and see our interview with Jimmy Stewart. Stewart was himself a World War II B-24 Liberator pilot, and he and Lindbergh were friends before the war, although Stewart differed from Lindbergh in his political views. Again, see our video on James Maitland Stewart. His wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, later said that he deeply regretted that the public saw him as an anti-Semite, professing that his only interest was peace. In fact, his only advocacy after the war was on behalf of the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. He traveled widely around the world and even lived among the indigenous peoples of Africa and the Philippines for a time, before his death in 1974, far from the limelight of his 1920s and 30s. It is interesting to note that after World War II, Lindbergh wrote, "In order to defeat Germany and Japan, we supported the still greater menaces of Russia and China, which now confront us in the nuclear weapon era. The British Empire has broken down with great suffering, bloodshed, and confusion. France has had to give up her major colonies and turn to a mild dictatorship herself. Much of our Western culture was destroyed. We'd lost the genetic heredity formed through eons of millions of lives. Meanwhile, the Soviets have dropped their Iron Curtain to screen off Eastern Europe, and an antagonistic Chinese government threatens us in Asia." In 1972, while accompanying a television crew investigating a lost tribe in the Philippine Islands, Lindbergh and the group were stranded when their helicopter broke down. They were rescued by the 31st Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron based at Clark Field. Charles Lindbergh died on Maui, Hawaii on August 26, 1974. He was buried at the Palapala Hohumau Church Cemetery in Kapahulu, Maui. Charles Lindbergh lived a great life of staggering highs and devastating lows, hailed as a hero, condemned as a traitor, and ultimately buried in quiet obscurity. But his legacy remains complicated. Was he a patriot blinded by fear? A political idealist who misjudged history? Or something far more troubling? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.